Hello, everybody. I'm here to talk about an economic indicator that recently came out, CPI. And CPI is a measure of inflation in our economy. And this has been in the news, so there's nothing better to cover than inflation. Now, a little background on CPI. For people who are taking my macroeconomics class, we are definitely going to be covering inflation. But please note that CPI is not a economy-wide measurement of inflation. CPI covers one segment, albeit a large segment of the economy, which is the consumer sector. There are other measurements of inflation, but this is the most widely reported measurement of inflation in the media. So definitely we want to cover it. And what I'm going to do here is I got a graph up that's measuring two parts of CPI. One is the total. Let me get my pen going here. The total, and the other one is core. Now, let's talk the total first. Now, the total is the blue line that you see here, and you could see it came out at a whopping 9.1%. Now, that's a 12-month average, a 12-month year over year. So basically, you look at CPI in June of last year compared to June this year, and it increased 9.1%. And as you can see by this graph going all the way back to June 2006 to present, that is a historic high. And the other measurement is core CPI. Now, core CPI is simply the CPI and you subtract out energy and food prices. Now, the reason why is because energy and food prices are volatile and they can go up and down, and they could really distract from any change in the underlying trend. So some people like to subtract it out and see where inflation is going without those two volatile components. And you can see that came out at, I believe, that was a 5.9% annual rate. That's also very high, as you can see by this yellow line going back to June 2006. The only good news here is you do see a little dip in core CPI from May. That's, I guess, slightly good news. But this is not a very good picture when it comes to inflation in the economy. Now, I'm going to be talking about underlying inflation pressures and what can the future hold. But for right now, this is not a good report. Now, this means that in order to get inflation down, one of two things is going to have to happen. Either we're going to have to slow demand, or we're going to have to increase supply in terms of goods and services. Now, the Federal Reserve, which is our nation's central bank, is trying to use monetary policy, basically interest rates, to slow the economy down to get inflation under control. So basically, they're looking at the demand side, not the supply side. And they made a rather large increase in their target interest rate of 75 basis points last meeting. Now, 75 basis points, that's 0.75%. And based upon this report, they're probably going to raise it another 75 basis points the next meeting. And so now the question is this going to continue? Well, there are a couple of ways you could look at it. Well, what are some of the things causing an increase in inflation? Well, one of them is rising prices for commodities, those inputs needed to produce goods and services. In other words, costs of production are going up. Now, therein lies some good news. So let me just go to a picture of, let me just move this over for you a little bit. This is some commodity prices. So these are measuring inflation on the input side of the economy. And oil is definitely one of them. So let's click on oil. And as you can see, oil has come down somewhat. Let me get my pen back up. Since basically June it's been going down, and it's under $100 a barrel, which is good news. And that could cause some easing at the gas pump, and it could cause some easing in the production of goods that need gas and oil. But notice how this drop did not start until, actually, you can't see the dates there. Let me just move this down a little bit. Let me just change this, and I'm just going to move this down so you can see actually the date range. So now there you go. So you can see in June, oh, come on, oh, I can't, it's not going to allow me to draw here. There we go. In June, that's when you started to see the drop in oil prices, which means it takes time for this to work its way into the CPI. So you wouldn't see this effect in the June report for CPI. You may see it in the next coming reports. Now let's take a look at another commodity. Let's look at copper. Copper is another key component in the production process. And as you can see from copper, same dynamic here, right? You've got around June, you're seeing this big drop off in copper prices. Again, not going to be part of the picture in the June CPI report. Let's go back to, how about food thing? Let's look at wheat. Again, a little bit before June, mid-May, right? We're talking about mid-May, right about here. You see this drop off in food prices. Let's take a look at corn. And by the way, I apologize for the audio. My microphone is broken, and I'm using my computer microphone, which is not the best in the world, so I apologize for that. Let's look at corn. And you can see corn didn't start falling until mid-June. So we've got mid-June right here, and then also a precipitous drop. So basically what I'm telling you is that there are releasing of pressures on consumer inflation in the commodity sector. Now, what I don't have up here are wages. That's another big driver of costs. And wage growth is also slowed. So that's another factor that could cause inflation to ease up latter part of this year. Now, the danger is, even though we may have costs going down, if consumer inflation stays high enough, that could cause expectations in consumers for inflation to remain high. Now, that's another fancy way of saying is if consumers expect higher inflation will happen. Why? Well, you will act in a way that will cause higher inflation. For example, if you think inflation is going to be a lot higher next year, you may ask for a raise just to cover the increase in the cost of living. Now, that raise is going to cause an increase in labor costs. An increase in labor costs could cause prices of the good produced to go up. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's the danger. Entrenched inflation expectations. So how can we gauge inflation expectations? Well, one kind of neat way is to look at the financial markets, because there are U.S. government treasuries. These are basically U.S. government bonds that offer inflation protection. They're called TIPS, T-I-P-S, Treasury Inflation Protection, Treasury Index. I forget what the TIP stands for, but TIPS. And they give you a interest rate or yield that covers inflation. So think about this. If you buy a 5-year TIPS, it's supposed to give you a yield and some positive amount that covers inflation. So if you compare a non-TIPS treasury to a TIPS in treasury, the difference between the two yields should be the expectation for inflation. So let's take a look at that. Here is the latest 5-year TIPS. It's called the break-even rate. Now, what this break-even rate is simply the non-TIPS treasury minus the TIPS treasury. And the difference is the 5-year expectation for inflation in the bond market. And as you could see, let me get my pen here. In April of this year, that was a high. So the 5-year expectation was 3.5%. Now, again, that's high compared to, let's go back 5 years. Let me just change this. Let's go 5 years. You could see that was a high, but it's nowhere near what the actual inflation rate. Think about it. We had a 9.1% inflation rate in June. So that tells you something. That what that tells you is that even though inflation expectations are higher, they don't expect it, at least the bond market does not expect it to stay this high for very long. But the important point is the Treasury market is seeing that their expectations for the medium term to fall. And right now it sits at only 2.56%. Which means there is the financial markets don't expect the inflation to stay at this level at least within the next 5 years. Now, that's a long time, but it's showing you that if inflation expectations were entrenched, you would see this break-even chart continue to go up, 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 and that will tell you that inflation expectations are entrenched. So, yes, this report for inflation was bad news in terms of getting some sort of relief. But it does seem that by the end of this year, we should see inflation coming down. Well, that's all for now, and I welcome your comments.